The air inside America's wartime factories was thick with heat, oil, and the clatter of steel. Sparks rained from welding torches, while conveyor belts rattled under the weight of half-assembled machines of war. This was no ordinary workplace. These industrial floors had become battlefields of their own, where time was the greatest enemy. In 1942, as men marched across Europe and the Pacific, the United States faced a monumental challenge: how to produce enough weapons, vehicles, and ammunition to feed the largest war in human history. Factories that had once built cars, appliances, and farm tools were suddenly converted into arsenals of democracy, expected to supply an army fighting on two fronts. Into this roaring world of noise and urgency stepped a new kind of worker. They were women who only months earlier had been teachers, clerks, housewives, and farmhands. Many had never touched a drill press or handled sheet metal. Yet now, they were handed wrenches, welding torches, and rivet guns. The image was striking, and for many Americans, almost surreal. Rows of women, their hair tied back in scarves, stood shoulder to shoulder on production lines that stretched the length of city blocks. Their faces were serious, their movements practiced, and their presence symbolized a radical shift in how the nation viewed labor and survival. The urgency was palpable. War had stripped America of its traditional workforce, sending millions of men to distant battlefields. Factories risked falling silent at precisely the moment when the world needed them most. Without weapons, the Allies could not fight, and without constant replacement of tanks, planes, and artillery, battles would be lost before they began. Yet shutting down assembly lines was not an option. The solution was both obvious and revolutionary. Women would step into the void and keep the machines of war running. It was a gamble, but one that America had no choice but to take. At first, their presence was met with a mix of curiosity and doubt. Supervisors looked on as women picked up heavy tools, unsure if they would succeed. The roar of engines being tested and the rhythm of hammers striking metal provided the soundtrack of this experiment. Every moment carried a sense of urgency, as if history itself waited to see if these women could deliver. The survival of soldiers thousands of miles away depended on the outcome of their work. With every rivet, every welded seam, every tightened bolt, they were not just building machines, they were shaping the course of the war. The transformation of these spaces was more than physical. A cultural shift had begun, though few recognized it at the time. Women who once defined themselves by their homes or local communities suddenly found themselves part of a national mission. They stood inside cavernous factories that smelled of oil and steel, their voices lost in the roar of machinery, their hands raw from constant labor. Yet they worked without hesitation, driven by the knowledge that their brothers, husbands, and sons depended on the weapons they built. For the first time in American history, the home front and the battlefront were bound together in such a visible, tangible way. This was the dawn of a new chapter in America's war effort. The factories became more than just workplaces. They became symbols of resilience, of ordinary citizens rising to extraordinary demands. The clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches were the sounds of a nation refusing to surrender to circumstance. While soldiers carried rifles across muddy fields and pilots braved the skies over hostile territory, women at home were waging their own kind of war. Their battleground was steel and sweat, and their weapons were speed, precision, and sheer endurance. The story of women stepping into America's war factories is not one of quiet assistance, but of a fundamental transformation. The hook of the tale is simple yet powerful. When the arsenal of democracy seemed at risk of collapse, women ensured it did not. They became the unexpected soldiers of industry, pushing machines and themselves to the limit. The scene was vivid, dramatic, and almost cinematic, with every shift echoing with urgency and purpose. This was not merely work. It was history being forged in steel, fire, and determination. The arrival of women in the factories did not instantly erase doubt or resistance. For many in positions of authority, the idea of women mastering heavy machinery seemed far-fetched, even dangerous. Factory supervisors, hardened by years of industrial work, questioned whether these new recruits could handle the physical strain of lifting metal sheets, managing loud presses, or keeping pace with assembly lines that never stopped. Some men joked that women would spend more time fixing their hair than fixing an engine. Others believed they would give up after a few days, unable to endure the relentless demands of war production. The skepticism was not hidden, and women felt it in the sharp stares and muttered comments as they walked onto the factory floor. Yet, Every clang of the hammer and every twist of a wrench began to silence those doubts. Women adapted with surprising speed, learning to handle rivet guns that kicked hard against their arms, or welding torches that hissed like angry serpents. They grew calluses on their hands, grease stained their uniforms, and sweat soaked their brows, but they refused to falter. Factories had expected to slow down while they trained, but instead, the opposite happened. Production times began to shrink. What once took days could now be completed in hours. The contrast between expectation and reality was staggering. This transformation created a quiet tension on the shop floor. Men who had once doubted them now watched as women developed new methods of efficiency. They discovered ways to organize tools more effectively, to share tasks in smoother sequences, and to maintain a pace that kept conveyor belts constantly moving. Many supervisors, once skeptical, began to note the difference in output. Charts and production boards filled with rising numbers told the story no one could ignore. The skepticism of the early weeks was being dismantled not through arguments, but through the undeniable evidence of results. For the women themselves, the contrast was deeply personal. They had been told for years that their place was in the home, not in the factory. Now, they were proving the opposite in real time. Each successful weld and each perfectly set rivet was a defiance of the limitations others had placed upon them. They stood in noisy, grease-filled workshops, where the smell of molten metal clung to the air, and they knew that every hour they worked was another step away from the old world. The disbelief of others became fuel for their determination, and that determination drove production beyond all expectations. On a broader scale, the shift was visible across the nation. Newspaper articles that had once reported on shortages and delays began to highlight the success of factories staffed by women. Photographs of women in overalls, sleeves rolled up, faces streaked with sweat, began to replace the gloomy headlines of earlier months. The public saw not frailty, but strength. For many Americans, the contrast was startling. The stereotype of women as fragile and incapable was dissolving before their eyes, replaced by an image of resilience and resolve. The conflict of expectation versus reality defined this early chapter of America's industrial war effort. It was not just about machines or output, but about identity and perception. The doubts that had once cast long shadows over the factory floor were steadily retreating. In their place stood proof that women were not only capable, but often indispensable. By the time the first year of their work had passed, the shock had given way to a grudging respect. What had begun as a reluctant experiment was turning into one of the most unexpected strengths of the American arsenal. The story of women entering America's wartime factories did not begin with bold declarations or sweeping reforms. It began quietly as a response to necessity. When the United States joined World War II, millions of men left behind the work that kept factories alive. Shipyards, steel plants, and airplane assembly lines faced empty floors at the very moment the nation needed them most. Government leaders and industrial managers realized that without replacements, the production of weapons would collapse. The answer, though simple in theory, was radical in practice. Women would step into the roles left vacant by soldiers. For many women, this shift meant stepping into a world they had never imagined for themselves. A farmer's daughter who had spent her life tending livestock now stood in front of a roaring drill press. A secretary who once typed letters in quiet offices found herself pulling long hours in a shipyard, her hands raw from handling steel cables. Housewives who had known only kitchens and laundry now climbed scaffolding to weld the frames of bombers. These transformations were not merely physical. They were cultural leaps that changed how women understood their own abilities and how the nation understood them as well. At first, the government treated this as a temporary measure. Propaganda posters and recruitment campaigns asked women to join the workforce, but always with the promise that their jobs would be waiting for men once the war ended. This was not meant to be a permanent revolution. Women were to fill the gap, nothing more. Yet as the months passed, it became clear that their contribution was more than a stopgap. Factories began to rely on them, not simply as replacements, but as essential workers in their own right. They learned quickly, mastered machines, and kept pace with the demands of production in ways no one had predicted. The origins of this transformation were practical, but they carried an emotional weight as well. Women did not simply take these jobs for wages or pride. They carried with them the faces of husbands, brothers, and sons who were fighting far away. Every rivet driven into the body of a bomber, every seam welded into a tank, was personal. It was an act of connection, a way of supporting loved ones they might never see again. The emotional bond between the home front and the battlefield became one of the most powerful driving forces of wartime production. Training programs sprang up across the country, designed to turn inexperienced recruits into skilled workers. Within weeks, women who had never seen a factory floor could identify tools, read blueprints, and keep up with the relentless rhythm of production lines. The smell of burning steel, the vibration of heavy machinery, and the deafening sound of presses became part of their daily lives. What had once seemed impossible quickly became routine. Women adapted not just with skill, but with creativity, often finding better ways to streamline processes that had been in place for years. The background of this story reveals how necessity became opportunity. The government may have invited women into factories out of desperation, but the women themselves turned that opportunity into something larger. By proving they could not only replace men, but in some cases outperform them, they redefined the meaning of labor in America. The origins of their involvement were rooted in crisis, but the legacy they began to shape was one of resilience and strength. The story of women in wartime factories was not just about filling vacancies. It was about rewriting expectations and setting in motion a change that would echo long after the war was won. The work of women in American factories was not confined to the walls of assembly lines. Its true impact could be seen thousands of miles away, across the oceans and into the heart of the battlefields. Every rivet, every weld, and every completed aircraft carried with it the labor of women who never set foot on foreign soil, but whose efforts reached the front lines all the same. Soldiers in muddy trenches and pilots soaring into combat relied on weapons and machines that only existed because women had kept the factories alive. The connection between home front and battlefield was direct and immediate, even if unseen. Imagine a pilot stepping into the cockpit of a bomber somewhere in Europe. The fuselage gleamed, the engines roared with strength, and the wings bore the weight of hundreds of hours of labor. Many of those hands belonged to women, their fingerprints embedded in the rivets that held the plane together. When that pilot flew into danger, he carried with him the invisible presence of women who had built the machine. It was the same for a soldier in the Pacific, holding a rifle manufactured by women who worked endless hours to meet quotas. The battlefield was supplied not only by industry, but by the determination of a workforce that had once been underestimated. The speed of production altered the tempo of the war. Battles that might have been lost for lack of equipment became winnable because replacements arrived on time. Tanks rolled into Europe in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy, and planes filled the skies with a force that could not be matched. Ammunition shipments arrived steadily, feeding the firepower that Allied troops needed to press forward. Behind these victories lay the unseen but essential contribution of women who had turned raw steel and parts into the weapons of liberation. Their presence on the factory floor became a weapon in itself, as decisive as any rifle fired in combat. For the men fighting abroad, letters from home often carried stories of wives, sisters, or daughters working in plants or shipyards. These words provided comfort, a reminder that the people they loved were fighting in their own way. It gave soldiers a sense of unity, knowing they were not alone in sacrifice. The image of women welding wings to planes or assembling artillery shells became part of the soldiers' imagination, a vision of strength waiting for them back home. In this way, production was more than physical supply. It was a morale booster, a constant reminder that the nation stood behind them in every possible way. The flow of equipment had a psychological effect on the enemy as well. The Axis powers had not anticipated such relentless output. Factories destroyed by bombing raids were rebuilt quickly, and production lines ran day and night, often staffed by women who refused to let shortages slow them down. When German or Japanese soldiers faced American forces, they often marveled at the abundance of weapons, vehicles, and supplies. Behind this abundance was the industrial miracle powered in large part by women. Their work tilted the balance of the battlefield, reinforcing the idea that America's strength lay not only in soldiers, but in the workers at home. The impact of women's labor was therefore both visible and invisible. Visible in the form of planes, tanks, and weapons flooding into battle, and invisible in the way it shaped morale, confidence, and strategy. It was not an exaggeration to say that every successful campaign of the war carried the mark of women's labor. Without them, supply lines would have broken, soldiers would have fought with dwindling resources, and the war might have dragged on far longer. Instead, their presence ensured that America could fight with speed, with strength, and with the certainty that reinforcements were always on the way. In the end, the battlefield victories of World War II were not earned by soldiers alone. They were shared victories, the product of countless hands back home who labored through long nights and early mornings. Women who had once been strangers to factories became essential allies in combat, even though they never fired a weapon. Their role was quiet, unheralded at first, but their work echoed in every explosion, every flight, and every advance across enemy lines. In the great equation of war, their contribution was the constant that made victory possible. The consequences of women's entry into wartime factories stretched far beyond the immediate needs of production. What began as a temporary response to crisis gradually reshaped how the nation thought about work, gender, and responsibility. In neighborhoods across America, families watched as women who had once been confined to kitchens or classrooms walked to factories at dawn, lunch pails in hand, their uniforms smudged with oil and grit. The sight was unfamiliar, even unsettling to some, but it became a daily reminder that the war had changed everything. Women were no longer bystanders to the nation's struggle. They had become central participants. This transformation challenged long-standing assumptions. For decades, society had insisted that women lacked the physical strength or technical ability for industrial labor. Yet the evidence was now impossible to deny. Assembly lines ran smoothly under their direction. Production quotas were met, and in many cases, efficiency improved. Photographs captured their determination. Women balancing on scaffolding to weld steel beams. Others crouched over engines with tools in hand, their expressions focused and unyielding. These images began to circulate widely, reshaping the public imagination. The fragile stereotype of women gave way to a new image of competence, grit, and resilience. The wider consequences also played out in the culture of the factory itself. Workplaces that had once been dominated by men adapted to the presence of women. Break rooms filled with new voices, and the hum of machinery was joined by laughter, determination, and the occasional song. Supervisors who once doubted them began to rely on them, not as novelties, but as dependable workers. The morale inside factories shifted. A sense of unity took hold, forged not by tradition, but by the shared weight of responsibility. It was a subtle but profound change that altered the dynamic of American labor for good. On the home front, families adjusted to new rhythms. Children saw their mothers come home exhausted, hands rough from work, but proud of their role in the nation's fight. Husbands who had once expected their wives to remain at home read letters from the front that spoke of women mastering welding, riveting, or machine assembly. These stories spread across the nation, reminding everyone that the war effort was not fought by soldiers alone. Even those who never stepped foot on a battlefield contributed, and that contribution demanded recognition. The social fabric of America was being rewoven, thread by thread, inside the walls of its factories. The symbolic power of this shift was immense. Propaganda posters, once designed to encourage women to enter the workforce, began to reflect their strength and determination. The famous image of a woman flexing her arm with the caption, "We can do it," became not just a call to action, but a statement of fact. Women could do it, and they were doing it every day. This was more than advertising. It was a reflection of a nation in transition, learning to see its women as capable contributors to victory, rather than silent supporters from the sidelines. Yet these consequences carried a tension as well. While women proved themselves indispensable, there was always the looming question of what would happen when the war ended. For now, factories thrived on their labor, and soldiers depended on their output. But beneath the surface, society wrestled with the idea of permanence. Would women return to their kitchens once the guns fell silent, or had the boundaries of labor shifted forever? This question lingered in the background, even as production continued at record speed. The uncertainty of the future did not erase the reality of the present. Women had already altered the course of the war, and with it, the course of American history. The wider consequences of this transformation reached into every corner of society. They changed how families lived, how factories functioned, and how the nation understood its own identity. What began as a temporary adjustment had grown into something deeper, a movement that could not be fully undone. Women had stepped into roles once closed to them, and in doing so, had expanded the definition of what it meant to serve one's country. These consequences were not just measured in weapons produced or hours worked. They were measured in the shifting tides of perception, in the breaking down of barriers, and in the lasting mark left on the fabric of American life. By the middle of the war, The experiment of women in the factories was no longer a question. It was a triumph. The moment of climax arrived when production figures shattered even the most optimistic forecasts. American factories were producing planes, tanks, and rifles at a pace that stunned allies and enemies alike. Rows of bombers rolled off assembly lines with such speed that foreign observers could scarcely believe their eyes. What had once been dismissed as impossible was now undeniable fact. Women were not only holding the line, they were driving it forward. Inside the factories, the pace was relentless. The air buzzed with the rhythm of machinery, punctuated by the sharp clang of metal and the hiss of welding torches. Women stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms streaked with grease, their hands calloused from endless repetition. Shifts stretched long into the night, but fatigue did not slow them. Every completed machine carried the weight of urgency, as if they understood that hesitation could cost lives on distant battlefields. Supervisors, once skeptical, now counted on women as the backbone of production, often admitting quietly that they had been wrong to doubt. The climax of this transformation was not just in numbers, but in recognition. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating record-breaking output. Photographs showed women beside the machines they had built, smiling despite exhaustion. Communities across the nation took pride in the accomplishments of their factories, knowing that their local daughters, sisters, and mothers had helped make it possible. The image of women in overalls became more than propaganda. It became reality, etched into the consciousness of a nation that could no longer ignore their contribution. On the battlefield, the results were felt in decisive ways. Supplies never stopped flowing. Soldiers marveled at how quickly destroyed equipment was replaced. Commanders strategized with confidence, knowing they could depend on the constant stream of arms and vehicles. For the enemy, the sheer volume of American production became a source of despair. German and Japanese forces fought bravely, but they could not match the industrial power that now seemed unstoppable. Behind this industrial avalanche stood the women who had embraced the work with tireless resolve. The turning point came when doubts transformed into admiration. Those who had once sneered at the thought of women in industry now pointed with pride to their achievements. The skepticism of the early days was forgotten, replaced by the acknowledgement that without women, victory might not have been possible. This reversal marked the climax of their journey, from underestimated replacements to indispensable warriors of production. Their triumph was not quiet. It was visible in every machine that left the factory floor and thundered into war. In the collective memory of the time, this peak was not just about weapons. It was about courage and endurance, about proving wrong every limitation placed upon them. The climax was as much emotional as it was industrial. It was the moment when women, once hidden in the shadows of expectation, stood in the light of achievement. They had been tested under the greatest pressure imaginable, and they had prevailed. The war had demanded the impossible, and women had delivered it. This was the high point of America's industrial mobilization, the moment when the world understood the full scale of its power. It was also the moment when women's role in that story could no longer be ignored. The climax was not a single day or event, but a surge of collective effort, a tide of labor and determination that carried America closer to victory. It was a moment when history turned, forged in the sweat and strength of women who had redefined what it meant to fight for their country. When the war finally drew to a close, the factories that had once thundered with urgency began to quiet. The long hours, the ceaseless noise of machinery, and the constant pressure to deliver were replaced with a new uncertainty. For many women, the end of the war meant the end of their time on the factory floor. Men returning from the front reclaimed their old jobs, and women were expected to return to their homes. Yet something profound had changed, both in the women themselves and in the nation that had come to rely on them. They had proven their worth in ways that could not be erased, no matter how hard society tried to return to the old order. The legacy of their work was not just in the millions of weapons, tanks and planes that had rolled off the assembly lines. It was in the shift of perception, the breaking of boundaries that had once seemed unmovable. A woman who had once been seen only as a homemaker had shown herself capable of building machines that helped win a global war. The strength she discovered in herself, and that the world saw in her could not easily be dismissed. Even when some were forced back into traditional roles, the memory of what they had achieved lingered. It became a seed planted in the soil of American society, waiting for its time to grow. For the soldiers who returned, the recognition of women's contribution was deeply felt. They knew that their survival had depended not only on their own courage, but on the invisible hands that had built the weapons they carried into battle. Many told stories of pride about wives, sisters, and mothers who had become workers of steel and fire. For them, the war had proven that the fight for survival was shared, fought not just in the mud of foreign fields, but in the roar of American factories. This understanding brought respect, even if it did not always translate into lasting change. The nation, too, carried forward the memory of those years. The image of women in overalls, with determined faces and steady hands, became part of the national story of victory. It was immortalized in posters, photographs, and films that celebrated the arsenal of democracy. Even as many women returned to traditional roles, the idea that they could do more had been established. The war had revealed a truth that could not be buried. Women were capable of sustaining the nation in its darkest hours. That knowledge, once revealed, would not disappear. In the decades that followed, this legacy became a foundation for future movements. Though the immediate post-war years often tried to push women back into silence, the memory of their strength during World War II remained a quiet but powerful force. It reminded future generations that the walls of limitation could be broken, and that courage and skill knew no gender. The war had been a crucible, and within it, women had proven themselves not just as helpers, but as vital builders of victory. Closing the chapter of World War II, the story of women in the factories remains more than a tale of production. It is a story of transformation, of how necessity opened doors that had long been locked. It is the story of a nation that discovered hidden strength in half its population, a strength that changed the meaning of labor and service forever. The legacy of these women endures in every workplace that followed, in every challenge where resilience is demanded, and in every reminder that history is shaped not only by those on the battlefield, but also by those who fight with tools, with sweat, and with unyielding resolve. Their contribution to victory was written in steel and smoke, in the rhythm of machinery, and in the unbreakable determination of their hands. They were the quiet army that never marched, the soldiers of production who built faster, stronger, and with more conviction than anyone predicted. Their story does not end with the war. It continues in the echoes of progress, in the recognition of possibility, and in the unshakable truth that America's arsenal of democracy was forged by women as much as by men. That is their closing chapter, and it is their enduring legacy.